Okay, welcome back to Unit 5. This is lesson 5.2. So 5.1, we solve linear systems by graphing. Again, solving means finding the point of intersection, so where these two linear equations cross. Our next two lessons, so 5.2 and 5.3, are going to be on algebraic models for solving linear systems. So our first one is going to be this method that we're going to call substitution. Now, when you hear that word substitution, you're thinking about replacing. So, like when players replace each other in a game, that's the same idea that we're going to be doing here with math. We're going to be solving for these variables and then replacing them into the other equations. So, what this method looks like is I've written down 5 steps that we need to follow. The first step is that we're going to choose an equation that has a 1 in front of the variable. So we know that variables are letters. And if we look at these variables for these two equations above, we've got x's and y's because we're dealing with linear equations. And if I look at the first equation with the variable x, I have a 2 in the front. That's no good. I don't want that. But if I look at the y, it does have a 1. Same with the x, and same with the y in the second equation. So any of these variables for step number 1 would be the right choice. The second step is to isolate for those variables. So any variable that I choose that has a 1 in the front, I'm basically going to be bringing everything to the other side and isolating, performing opposite operations to get that letter by itself. The third step, now that I know what that variable is, I can substitute it, this is why we call it substitution, into the other equation, the one that we didn't use. Then step number 4 is ultimately solving for the variable. And then step number 5, now that we know one of the variables, either we know the x value or the y value, we're going to substitute it back into step 2 to solve for the missing variable. So let's see what all these steps look like. So my first step is to choose either the 1y from my first equation or the 1x or 1y from my second equation. For step number 1, I'm going to choose the second equation. X plus y equals 8. And I'm going to choose to isolate for x. So that means I'm going to take the y and bring it to the other side. And I'm going to get x by itself. So now we're moving into step number 2 of isolating for that variable. So when I took that positive y and brought it to the other side, it became a negative, and the 8 still stayed as a positive. Now I know what x is. X is 8 minus y. If I understood what y was, if I was given it, then I'd be able to actually solve what the numerical value of x is, but x is 8 minus y. Now step number 3 is the important part, and it's a little bit confusing for us. It's taking the equation that we didn't use and subbing in or replacing the variable that we solved for. So here's what that means. I'm going to take the equation that I didn't use. 2x plus y equals 11. And now that I know what x is 8 minus y. In this equation, when I see an x, I'm going to replace it with 8 minus y. When we do that, we have to be very careful. We have to put that 8 minus y in brackets. And there's always going to be some sort of bracket around this substitution. So now, we have to solve by replacing that variable. So step number 4 here is to solve for the variable. So what I'm going to be doing is replacing x. So the 2 doesn't go anywhere. The 2 is a part of the equation. But now I'm going to be replacing that x with 8 minus y. Because at the beginning here, it's saying x is, that's what that equal sign means, is 8 minus y. X is 8 minus y. So x is 8 minus y plus, then I'll continue the equation, plus y equals 11. Now this is why we did our previous unit with solving equations, because now we're going to need to, for step number 4 here, solve for this. So we know from that previous unit that we're going to have to first expand. So that means break this bracket. So 2 multiplied by 8, 2 multiplied by negative y. So 2 times 8, 16. 2 times negative y, negative 2y, plus y equals 11. Now I can collect like terms. 16 will move over and be with the 11. And negative 2y and positive y will go together. Now remember, if it helps you out, write down that in front of that y is a 1. So that when you use your calculator to add negative 2 and 1 together, you'll know that you're dealing with a negative 1y. On the other side, I have a positive 11. And because that 16 used to be a positive, when I moved it over, it became negative 16. So now 11 minus 16 is negative 5. And a lot of you made mistakes on this on the last test when you had a negative variable. It's still not done. This negative 1y is not fully solved. You need to get rid of that negative 1. You need to turn it to a positive. So negative 1 multiplied by y, the opposite is to divide by it. So I'm going to divide both sides by negative 1. And then my solution is 5 for y. So all we did in this step, don't get confused. Don't think that I'm trying to teach you something new here. This is the previous unit. This is unit 4, when all we did was expand, move, or collect like terms, and then perform opposite operations to solve for the missing variable. So now that we know what our y value is for our point of intersection, step number 5 is telling me to go back to step 2 and to substitute the variable. So let's see what that means. If I go back to step number 2, here's step number 2, it's saying that x is 8 minus y. So now I can actually solve for that x value because I know that y is 5. So x equals 8 minus 5. 8 minus 5 is 3. So now I've solved for my point of intersection. I know that the point of intersection, the POI, point of intersection, is always a point where these two linear equations crossed. So that point is an x and a y, and I was able to solve that my x value was 3 and my y value was 5. Now we can take these same 5 steps and solve for any linear equation by using this method of substitution. So let's practice again. Step number 1, it says to choose an equation that has a 1 in front of a variable. So now looking at my next example over here, there's a 1 in front of this x, there's a 4 in front of the y, a 5 in front of this x, and a 2 in front of this y. So I only have one option here, and that's this 1x. So for step number 1, the only equation that I can choose is x plus 4y equals 11. There's no other option here. In this previous example, I could have chosen any one of these variables to solve for. So now, step number 2 is to isolate that variable and bring it to the other side. So this means bring everything to the other side, sorry. So now for step number 2, this x plus 4y equals 11. I'm going to take this positive 4y and bring it to the other side so that x is equal to 11, and then that positive 4y becomes negative 4y, and now I've just completed the second step. And I know that x is 11 minus 4y. The third step is going to be to substitute the variable into the other equation, into the equation that we didn't use. So now if I go back, we use this first equation and we isolated for this x. So the other equation is 5x minus 2y equals negative 11. So for the third step, 5x minus 2y equals negative 11. And I'm going to substitute the variable that I solved for. So I know that x is 11 minus 4y. And this 11 minus 4y goes together. So if it goes together, that means I need to put it in brackets. So 5x is 11 minus 4y. Then I'll just continue writing the equation from above. So minus 2y equals negative 11. Now this is from Unit 4. This is nothing new. We're going to be expanding and solving for the variable y. So the first thing that we're going to do, and it's very repetitive as you can tell, we're always going to be expanding and isolating for that variable. So the first thing that we're going to do is multiply. 5 times 11 is 55. 5 times negative 4 is negative 20y. Minus 2y equals negative 11. And now we're going to move all the letters to one side and all the numbers to the other side, just like we did in the previous unit. You can use that method of putting up a wall. So this 55 belongs with the 11 on the other side. And this negative 20 and negative 2 will go together. So negative 20, negative 2, negative 11. And now that 55 is the only one that's changed. It used to be a positive 55. Now it's negative 55. And then we'll begin collecting like terms. So negative 20 minus 2 is negative 22y. And negative 11 minus 55 is negative 66. Now to get rid of that negative 22 in front of the y, because it's multiplying, we'll divide by negative 22. And then we can solve for y, which is negative 66 divided by negative 22, which is positive 3. So now we've reached the step of actually solving for y. And now we need to see step number 5 is to substitute the variable back into step number 2. So we're going to solve, if we know what y is, we're going to solve for what x is. So let's go back all the way to step number 2. And we're going to use this equation of x equals 11 minus 4y. And now we're going to replace that y with what we know it is, which is 3. So remember that y is 3. And let's go back here. X is 11 minus 4, which is multiplied by y. 4, which is y, which is 3. Then 11 minus 4 times 3. So I'm just using BEDMAS here. I could just type this into my calculator all in one shot. But 4 times 3, some of you don't have two-line calculators, so this is why I'm doing it this way. 4 times 3 is 12. And then 11 minus 12 is negative 1. So now you've solved for your x and your y value of your point of intersection. So that's the last step. Don't forget this last step, that the point of intersection, and you got to write it out for me, is -1 and 3. So that's all there is to substitution. Is simply choosing an equation where you have 1 as a variable, isolating for that variable, whatever it is, could be x, could be y, then substituting it into the other equation that's not used, solving for the missing variable, then going back into step 2 and replacing that variable to solve for the other unknown. And right now, I want you to practice substitution, completing the homework, and then we're going to be learning another method called elimination for 5.3. Take care. Now on this next page, you have 4 examples here. The 4 examples are the same as the ones that we just did. So they're very similar. So I'll be choosing a variable that has a 1 in the front. Now what I want to make clear here is if I look at this example for B, you might be tempted to isolate for this variable right here, which has -1y for step number 1. Do not do that. Step number 1 tells you to isolate for a variable that has a 1 in the front, a positive 1. So if I look at this x in the second equation, that does have a positive 1. Same with this y in the second equation, that has a positive 1. Choose this x or this y to isolate for. Do not choose -1y. That's incorrect for step number 1. You're going to check your solutions in the lesson page that I provided on Google Classroom. Look at C now. The first step is to isolate for a variable that has a 1 in the front. This y has a 1 in the front, this x has a 1 in the front, and this y has a -1 in the front. So I know that this -1 is no good. But this x, I could solve for that by taking this -y over, sure, no problem. But if I really think about it, this y is already by itself. It's already completed step 1 of isolating for the variable. Y is 2x minus 8. So all I'd have to do is replace y with 2x minus 8 and remember that there's a -1 in the front. Again, you're going to be checking your solutions against the answer pages provided on Google Classroom. This video right now at this point is just providing you with some of the tips and tricks that you might not understand from that posted lesson. Looking at this next example for D, how I chose the variable to isolate for, there's a 6 in front of this x, that's no good. A 2 in front of that y, that's no good. There's a -1 in front of this y, that's no good. The only variable that I can begin solving for is x for that first step. The same is true for E. 4x is no good, -7y is no good, -3y is no good. The only one that I can begin to solve for is x in the second equation. So that's the end of the lesson for substitution.